you everyone for coming to this conference. I think it's going to be an amazing conference. We've been thinking, like we had many webinars these days, either regional or in our own countries, and we've been looking a lot to what's going on, to the crisis, how to solve, how to navigate these crises. And we wanted, together with Julio and Manolo, to bring something a little different, to begin looking forward, to begin looking to the future. How are we going to navigate on a certain present, and how we're going to begin building for a better future with all the challenges that lie ahead, all the challenges and all the opportunities that lie ahead. So that's why we invited Pascal. Thank you, Pascal, for accepting the invitation and coming here. Before introducing you, I also want to take a minute to appreciate how marvelous technologies, and among the positive things, how amazing is that we are in executive forums today, a community of CEOs from the Patagonia to Canada, and we're beginning to connect in many ways and leverage on collective intelligence. That's amazing. Let's take this and let's keep on doing this to learn, grow, and share more inner forums and for beyond those. So with that said, let me introduce Pascal. Pascal, he's the co-founder of Be Radical, and he's the chair of Open Entrepreneurship and Innovation for Singularity University. He also held leadership positions at Google.org, at Mozilla, and eBay. He built technology startups and launched a venture capital firm. Kelly, si te puedes quitar la presentación de pantalla, te agradezco. I also want to introduce you to Jeffrey Rogers. He's the principal facilitator for Singularity University, and he designs unique experience of learning guided by storytelling. He will be working with Pascal during this presentation. He's also part of Be Radical. So Pascal, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you for accepting this invitation. We are in your hands.
Jose Antonio, thank you so much, my friend. And first of all, thank you so much, all of you, to spend time with us. For the next hour, we want to take you a little bit out of your potentially the here and now of the COVID crisis, and want to allow you to open the horizon a little bit to think about what comes next and how do you actually deal with all of this. And we are going to do this a little different than your classic interaction or non-interaction. And I brought, as Jose Antonio kindly already introduced, dear friend, colleague, and my partner in crime at Be Radical with me, Jeffrey Rogers. And I just want to toss it over to Jeffrey right away.
Thank you, Pascal. Thank you, folks. We really appreciate the invite. We appreciate you all hosting us, and we appreciate so many of you showing up. This is kind of an amazing thing. Right now, you have so many demands on your time. There are so many things that you could be doing, so many things that are probably on your mind, and you've chosen to be here. And I think that in itself is a remarkable thing. So we want to take a moment to appreciate that, and then also to acknowledge what it means to be here right now, and to acknowledge the peculiarity and the particularity of this particular context. And there's something that we often like to open with, a little bit of framing that I think Pascal does better than just about anybody. So Pascal, maybe you can set the scene a little bit for what it is that we're here to do right now.
Absolutely. And a few of you actually have seen me present probably at places like Singularity University. Clearly, Jose Antonio has seen me many times, clearly, probably a few times too many. But here's the thing. When you've seen me present in the last probably 3-4 years, you know that I have an opening statement, which is, if you're forgetting everything I'm going to tell you today, please keep one thing in mind. And that is that tomorrow will look dramatically different than today. And if you've heard me say this, a lot of you had probably sat back in your chairs and you kind of nodded kindly. And I made this comment that when I say tomorrow, I mean tomorrow literally in 24 hours, not in 5 years or 10 years. And this typically got me an amused look from the audience. And I believe what COVID has taught us more so than ever before is that this is so true. So we are going to spend some time today together to explore what the tomorrow looks like, because we are not here to talk about the today. We're not going to do another webinar on crisis management or cash flow management or how you get the latest government subsidies. All those are important. All those are relevant. I've seen many, many of those, of course, myself. Today, we are really focused on the tomorrow, the time after COVID. And Jeffrey, like, kick us off.
All right, yeah. So the first thing we want to acknowledge is the particular context. That's kind of the elephant in the room. This is a weird time. The other thing that we want to acknowledge, the other elephant in the room, so to speak, is the room itself. This is weird. We usually like to do these things all together, assembled live in person. Instead, we're on Zoom. So I want to acknowledge this, something I know about you. On some level, you hate webinars. And here's the thing. We do too. So we're going to do our best to make this thing a little bit of something different. We don't like to do webinars. We like to do learning exchanges. We don't like to talk at you. We like to have a conversation. I can already see that you people know where the chat is and you seem to like the chat. So we're going to make sure that we use that. And there's something else we like to use as well. I'm going to open with a quick poll just to get a sense of how you all are feeling and how you're coming into this today. So you should now see an active poll just asking you honestly, how are you feeling coming into this conversation in this particular moment? I give you just a few minutes to respond to this. Couple seconds as these click in.
Oh, I see already. I love it. I already see. So, you know, like the thing you don't know is that Jeffrey and I both see your responses. And I already love where this is going. You're clearly an enterprising audience.
Yeah, and these are all the correct answer. That's what I like about this. If you're terrified, that's totally understandable, and you're not alone. I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. If you're feeling strangely liberated, perhaps right now, feeling like maybe the things that you normally would have to do, you don't have to do, and you're free to do something else and to think a little bit bigger or a little bit differently. That's awesome. If you're still wishing you'd bought that Zoom stock, so am I. I totally understand where you're coming from. We're going to talk more about that later too, perhaps. If this is not the 2020 that you'd planned for, you're in the right place. And we're going to talk about what that means to be presented with something wildly different than what we were expecting and how we might make sense of it. And if, yes, you are just keen to be on another video call, well, I can understand that too. So here are your results, my friend. You can see most of you are feeling like we're in a moment of profound dislocation. This is not the 2020 you'd planned for. So let's talk about that moment then. And let's go ahead and move right into where we are and where we're going. All of you are aware of the COVID context. I don't need to belabor this. You know that sometime in the last couple of months, humanity has taken a collective leap off a cliff, and we are still in free fall. We're looking at something like 3 million infected. We're looking at something over 200,000 fatalities globally right now, and untold economic devastation, right? In the US alone right now, we're looking at 30 million new jobless claims in the last 6 weeks. We've never seen anything like this, and it may still be a long way to the bottom of this dive. But we know that there is a bottom, that time will come. We have, as of today, I think 89 at least vaccine candidates in development. We have hundreds of clinical trials right now registered with the World Health Organization. So as Pascal said, and as Jose Antonio said in the framing, we know that there is going to be a beyond, so we want to start thinking about it. We believe that there's a competitive advantage in maintaining that kind of futures thinking, that sort of expansive awareness of what might be, what we want to build. And maybe we can be thinking of this not just as a pit, but perhaps as a portal. And I'm borrowing this metaphor from the novelist Arundhati Roy, who suggests that pandemics historically have always given us a time to look at the world we've been in and imagine something new and think about where we're headed and what we might want to create. And when I encourage you to think about possible futures, I'm not meaning to suggest that we're going to wake up in a magical fantasy land after this and that we can all create whatever it is that we decide we want the world to look like. There is tremendous power, but there also are things to see in the present, in our today, that tell us about the shape that tomorrow will likely take on. Pascal threw into the Zoom chat, and I want to note this as well, that yes, if you all throw anything in Spanish, we have our dear friend, our colleague, and will be our translator when we move to Q&A. Mafe is with us. She is on top of things and here for you as well. But yeah, as I was saying, we can look around the present and we can see, in fact, that the post-COVID future is going to be shaped by trends that are already present, but they're accelerating. And we're seeing the acceleration of the development and adoption of the infrastructure of this new exponential era of the future. We're seeing present trends accelerated towards a future that we're going to be building together. And that future is also going to see a heightening, an exacerbation of many tensions that have long existed, but they're growing right now. And I say here that these are tensions of our own liminal time. Pascal always pushes me to explain liminal. I will admit that is an academic term for cultural anthropologists. It's an old bad habit, but it means to be between one world and the next. And I think that's where we are right now. And yes, we will share those slides. Accelerating trends, you probably have some on your mind. Here are the ones that come to my mind when I look at things that were already on the table. They were happening, and now they're happening a hell of a lot faster. Number one, we're seeing massively increased digitization and movement of services and operations to the cloud. You could say that the thing that the CEO, the CIO, and the CTO couldn't do for years of trying to push digital transformation, the C19, COVID, is getting done in weeks or months. We can see the acceleration of the design of work and learning to be ever more agile, distributed, and even decentralized by necessity. We can see in this moment the increasing aggregation of huge amounts of personal healthcare data. There's a reason for that, of course, but this has consequences for our future. Similarly, we're seeing the acceleration of the deployment of autonomous AI and robotic systems. There's a really interesting push that's already going on to think about what a zero-touch economy might look like. Is there a need to look for a workplace that is going to be less subject to disease outbreaks? Well, if you have more autonomous systems, then you've created that. But that raises some really interesting questions about how we think about the development of human capital and what kinds of systems we want to create. I also put down there that we're seeing accelerated adoption and construction of public-private surveillance networks, assimilating these huge pools of data and then operationalizing them for more intelligence. Again, there's a reason for that. Right now, we're very focused on ensuring public health, safety, security, but that exists in a tension. And this is one of the tensions that I think is exacerbated in our current moment, where that is on one side of this tension where the other side is personal privacy. And we might say right now, there's a strong argument for building systems that ensure public safety through these surveillance networks. But maybe we also need to be thinking about the long-term implications for privacy and our data security. Similarly, in this moment, we're seeing an increased tension between old school shareholder capitalism and the idea of a shared and social value, perhaps as an ultimate priority or value. And as we see more firms accepting more money from more governments in the form of public bailouts, there's going to naturally be a follow-on question for those firms. What do you owe society? What do you owe the people if the people were there for you in your time of need? So that's one that I think is going to be really interesting to keep an eye on. Similarly, there's a huge conversation opening up right now to reevaluate our global supply chains. Hugely complex, and we have to ask ourselves going forward, how do we weigh global cost efficiency against perhaps a new understanding of the value of local resilience? And I think we're going to see more questioning of what does it really mean to depend so much on offshoring and to depend so much on supply chains that can be broken by an outbreak like this one. And then I'm going to end with my favorite one. When I'm thinking about attention, a polarity, if you will, there are these two values that always exist in tension. On one hand, the short-term focus, and on the other, the long-term vision. And I think right now in this particular moment, there's a really strong push, a drive for a lot of us to focus intently on the here and now, thinking about putting one foot in front of the other, getting through the next quarter, and doubling down on the thing at the core of the business that we know we've done well in the past that might get us through the present. But what do we lose by not thinking about the future? Is there a competitive advantage to be realized by exercising that long-term vision? That's a question I would ask you. Two more, as I'm about to queue up things for Pascal. What do the signals that we can see in our present suggest about the scope of our possible futures? How can we already start to make out the contours and understand what that terrain might look like as we start to map it for ourselves? And then two, what can those signals tell us about building, not just for recovery, but really thinking about the beyond, the after COVID, when we want to prioritize resilience and relevance in the longer term? Are we really building for that future as well? And I would argue we need to be. And to dive into these questions, I want to bring Pascal back into the conversation. So I'm going to drop my slides and he'll bring his up now.
Absolutely. So let me start out with a quote. And I also want to address what Sergio just threw into the chat. He said, do you think this kind of learning will last in time, or will they forget at what happened? This is an excellent question, and we're going to explore this right now. And I want to start off with a quote from someone I probably wouldn't have thought I would ever quote, Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand wrote a long time ago, you can avoid reality, but you cannot avoid the consequences of avoiding reality. And I think this is when I first saw that quote, it really hit me. And I saw this quote way before COVID. And quite frankly, when I see the reaction of many government and governmental leaders in this world to COVID, particularly probably my own president here in the United States, I think this is probably a quote they should probably take in and think a little bit more about. But here's the thing. So good friends of ours, a gentleman called Gil Fora, runs the think tank called EYQ, which is the think tank for EY, the large consulting business. And EYQ, we work with them very closely, and they have a framework, which I really like. They talk about these 3 time horizons, the now, the next, and the beyond. And the whole argument was always, you need to be active in all 3 time horizons. I was on the phone with Gil just about 2.5 weeks ago, and I asked him, Gil, what's going on for you? What's going on for your clients? And again, EY being a global company, of course, 250,000 employees, etc. And he made a very, very interesting statement to me, which I think hits the nail on the head. He said, what used to be the now, the next, and the beyond is now collapsing in time. The now and the next happens at the exact same point in time, which is right now. And I think we all feel this. And the beyond, which used to be beyond 5 years, 10 years, this is the somewhat far distant future, has now become a question about beyond COVID-19. So now we're asking ourselves the questions like, what happens in 2021 when we get out of this? So with this framing, I also want to introduce you to a good friend of mine, the exponential curve. At Singularity University, at the work we're doing at Be Radical, we talk a lot about technology and its exponential nature. By now, this is the good news. I don't need to show you an exponential curve anymore because you've seen so many that you can clearly identify them. The interesting thing about technology moving on exponentially accelerating curves, and think about artificial intelligence and robotics, etc., is that adoption does not typically move on the same curve. There's a gap between technology and adoption. And what we're currently seeing, and this is really exciting for us, it should be exciting for you, is what we call the COVID-19 bump. We're now seeing adoption being thrust forward by technology in ways we've never seen before. And of course, the examples are very obvious, like the sheer fact that you're looking at a Zoom session today. Zoom, previous to the crisis, had facilitated roughly 10 million user sessions per day. They just announced that they're facilitating 300 million user sessions per day right now in the crisis. It's a 30x increase in the usage. And we see the C19 bump in many, many other areas. Now, the important thing to keep in mind, though, is that, and I know it feels a little weird to say this because most of us feel like we're so in this here and now, and everybody talks about the virus and what that means. A lot of things do not change. And I encourage you to not take your eyes off this ball of all the things which don't change and or are already evolving, but are not directly related to the crisis. We will still use AI. We will still invest into robotics. We will still push forward on renewable energies. We will still push forward on synthetic biology. All these things happen. Some of them might be accelerated. The New York Times wrote an article where they started coining the term BC and AC. And they're using this in very different ways, that because BC is the time before COVID, AC is the time after COVID. And when I look at BC and AC, the two things which I find really interesting is the question of what will be gone? What is the stuff which we used before, which we used in the world BC, and which has gone, which has evaporated, which we're not doing anymore in the world AC? And this goes back to the question which was just asked by Sergio. What are the things which are new, like behaviors, things we're doing, services we're using, and what are the ones which have changed? And this opens up a really interesting question, because the interesting challenge will be to figure out what is the stuff which changes. And the question then becomes, what is the residue of that change? How much of that change will actually stay with us? And everything you need to know, of course, we can summarize in a single slide, the exponential curve. The important thing about the exponential curve is, and I want to reiterate this because I think it's so important, is this. If you're standing somewhere on this exponential curve, and again, technology, for example, moves predominantly on exponential curves. When you stand somewhere where this gentleman stands and you look to the past looks always flat and linear. The challenge for us is that the only thing we do know is the past. So all our judgment is typically based on the past. If you have the ability to see the future is crazy and steep and weird. Ernest Hemingway wrote a book called The Sun Also Rises. In this book, he has a quote which we now call the Hemingway Law of Motion. And the full quote is this: "How did you go bankrupt?" Bill asks. "Gradually, and then suddenly," Sam responds. I think that's true for bankruptcy, but much more importantly, and none of you should go bankrupt, much more importantly, it is true for exponential curves, it's true for technology, and it's true for the way the world moves today. It feels like for a long time nothing changes, and then suddenly the stuff pops up. And let me give you a simple and real world example for this. What you see here is the time we spent on digital devices, hours basically. From 2008 to 2018, this is data for the United States. It's very consistent around the world. The red bars is mobile phones, blue is PC laptops, white is other internet connected devices. I don't need to tell you that, of course, mobile phone devices have exploded on this world in a truly exponential fashion. If you have kids at home, you know this very, very well because they're glued to their devices. But here's the interesting question, and I want to do this as a little bit of an exercise. If I were to show you only the data for the year 2008, truthfully, absolutely truthfully, who would have said, looking at the data, I believe mobile is going to change the world? And then you can ask yourself the same question for the year 2009 and 2010 and so on. And Jeffrey just popped up a poll for you. And I want to ask you, when do you think, truthfully, would you have said that mobile is going to change the world? And of course, someone already pops in 2008.
Already an oracle in every room.
We always have the oracles in the group.
Future.
And, you know,
I love it.
Of course, there is people who have seen this early. But, you know, truthfully, for most of you, just looking at the data. And as the results are coming in, I'm seeing a pattern repeat, which is you have a few people who could see this early. And very often when you talk to them, they happen to have worked in the industry or have a connection to the industry, a very tangible way. And the vast amount of people, and this seems to be very clearly also what you are expressing here, which is just rolling in. And we share the results in just a second. I just want to give you one more second to fill this out. But the vast amount of people in the median, and we've done this exercise hundreds of times all around the world, say it is 2012. And I get it, because quite frankly, I would have said 2012 as well if you would have asked me. Now, here's the most important thing I can tell you about this graph, though. So let me quickly share the results one more time so you can have a quick look. 2012, and then there's a few people even going all the way to like 2015. Now, here's the important thing I can tell you. When you look at when some of the most important internet companies which leverage mobile at their core were being built, it gets really interesting. Airbnb was founded in 2008, Uber 2009, WhatsApp 2009, Instagram 2010, and the list goes on and on and on. What this means is that we would have collectively missed these companies not by 3 months or by half a year, we would have missed them by 3 years. So what you have to learn to do is you have to learn to read weak signals. And we're talking about this for a long time. We talk about these signals which are kind of like they feel like nothing happens for a really long time, and then they start to become these truly explosive trends. And again, like the most important thing I can tell you about this time we're now living in is that we are awash in weak signals. There's thousands of these weak signals now. And in the old days, I would have told you about weak signals we see in compute or in AI and algorithms or in the blockchain and quantum computing or neural interfaces in new renewable energy or genetic engineering. All these are still true. Remember, there's a lot of things which just will not change. We will still invest in AI, and AI will still be on these curves, potentially even accelerated. But now we're seeing a lot of new weak signals. And the question I want to ask is, what are the weak signals and what do they mean for us, and how do we extrapolate them into the future, and what is the residue of them? Let me give you a couple examples. Remote work. Remote work is a weak signal which is with us for a long time. There's a few companies which are doing remote work for a long time. It's a big debate in many places, but here's the thing. Now we are all remote workers. And when you look at the world of remote work, so you're spending your days like this instead of sitting in an office, the interesting question for me becomes twofold. One is, how does this look like when we go back to work? And we'll get there later. The more important question, the initial question is this: what are the consequences of remote work? And what are the consequences of the consequences? And what are the implications? Because this is where you get your disruption, but this is also where you get your open white spaces, your opportunities to do something interesting. And let me just show you a few. So remote work, without a doubt, will lead to a depression in commercial real estate. There's absolutely no question, because if you don't have as many people coming into your office, working from your office, you need less office space. Of course, obvious. But here's the interesting question. Now you can ask yourself, what is the consequence of commercial real estate going down, getting depressed? Now here's a really interesting one, and we already start to see this in the market. Residential real estate might go up. The size of the houses people buy here in Colorado, we spoke to a whole bunch of brokers. The size of the real estate people buy now goes up for the simple reason, and this is counter to a trend we had for a long time where the smallest houses, they actually sell really quickly. Now the bigger houses sell very well because people need more space, because you work from home. You can't just live in these tiny little houses, right? Things like your management practices will change. Your internet connectivity suddenly becomes a deciding factor if you can actually work from home or not, and so on and so on. And again, the interesting question for me is always, what is the consequence of that consequence? Because that gives you the white spaces. And now to the second part of the question, which is, how much residue will we have? Now here's the thing. The median daily commute time in the United States is 24 minutes. The median daily commute time in San Francisco, in a metropolis like San Francisco, is an hour. I'm pretty sure, having been with Jose Antonio in Mexico City a couple times, I'm pretty sure the median daily commute time in Mexico City is easily an hour each way. Now here's a fascinating question you can ask yourself. I used to work at Google. If I were to live in San Francisco like Jeffrey does, Google is in Mountain View, that's a 1 hour drive one way. If you have done this, and now you stop and you're sitting at home and you're working from home and you get your work done from home, I have a very hard time believing that if you work at Google, you will ever go back to a world where you want to do a 2 hour drive every single day for the rest of your life. you will probably not do that. There will be residue. Now, will we all work from home? No, of course not. But the number of people working from home will be significantly higher. And we see it. This is a survey being done by a recruitment firm. What they found is that with white collar workers, so office workers, 50% of those said this working from home thing is actually really nice. I save on the commute. I can spend more time with my family. You know, it might be a little stressy, but I get around it. 50% of them said, I want to continue to work from home at least a couple days a week. So here's another example. Food delivery is an interesting thing. So food delivery exploded onto the scene. And again, like you can ask yourself, what are the consequences of the consequences? And it was already brought up. Restaurants are changing. Commercial real estate is changing. Traffic will change. Here's an interesting one, packaging. We work with a German company called Henkel. They're a company which makes washing liquid, etc. A bit like Procter & Gamble. Their packaging is optimized for shelf space. It's optimized to be displayed on a supermarket shelf so that, when you walk through a supermarket, you think about, wow, this is great, I buy the package. In a world where food and other delivery becomes the norm, their packaging might change because now you need packaging which actually looks different. It needs to be optimized for shipping and delivery instead of being optimized for shelf space. Again, really interesting opportunities for the ones who can see those things and can extrapolate them and can figure out what that future looks like. So we spend a lot of time internally, as well as with all of our clients, to help them figure out what these trends look like. And then again, you can ask yourself, what's the residue? Well, we don't have any data yet on food delivery and the impact of COVID. But just to give you an idea, Amazon is hiring 175,000 people just for food delivery at the moment. They can't hire fast enough because the demand is so high. Walmart saw their app downloads soar 460% week over week because people want to use the app and basically start buying stuff. And this trend, and this is important to understand, most of these trends are not new. They're with us for a long time. They were just moving really, really, really slow. We had food delivery since 1996. The original food delivery company is Webvan. And if you're as old as I am and have lived through the .com bubble, you know that these guys very, very famously totally flamed out. But it had received the massive amount of its COVID-19 bump. And here's the data. Before COVID-19, already 37% of Americans bought groceries online. We don't know what the number is at the moment, but my gut feeling is it is at least 70%. Now, will we stay at 70%? No. But will we go back to 37? Also, no. Massive opportunities. And the time it takes for us to adopt technology has consistently gone down. It took us 50 years for the telephone to become truly adopted. The same is true for electricity. It took 40 years for the car to really hold place. It took only a couple years for the internet to hold place. And it takes literally days or months these days for any of these new technologies, newer trends, new behaviors to shape the world. The change you're going to see in the next 100 years equals the change we've seen in the last 20,000 years. The rate of change itself is accelerating. Today is the slowest day for the rest of your life, like it or not. So with that being said, I want to show you one last, and just to get your wheels turning, one last weak signal. And that weak signal is this. What you see here is a young girl. She's what we call an Instagram influencer. She's got 2 million followers on Instagram. She makes all of her money on Instagram. She's a little cheeky. She has a boyfriend. She loves to hang out, takes nice pictures with. She also is pretty famous, actually. She hangs out with, this is a famous art collector out of New York City. Here's the interesting thing. So this young lady, young woman, is called Michaela. Here's a fascinating thing. Again, Michaela, 2 million followers on Instagram, but Michaela is what we call a synth. She's synthetic. She doesn't exist. Michaela is a computer rendering. This is basically someone programming her and rendering her into those pictures. She's fake. but she has 1.9 million actual real world followers. She makes real money by wearing, clothing, for example, from her sponsors. Now, here's the interesting thing about Michaela. And I think Michaela is an interesting weak signal which points to a future which might evolve and come out there. Michaela doesn't get COVID. Michaela can work regardless if we all have to sit at home or not. Michaela can do photo shoots in areas which are currently off limits. Michaela can do whatever she wants because she's synthetic. Now, again, it is a weak signal, a very weak signal. It's happening in a weird corner of the internet with weird people following it. But Michaela might point to an interesting future, again, a weak signal, which you now can think about. What are the consequences of having something like our little friend Michaela here? With that being said, I want to toss it over to Jeffrey Rogers to take us really deep into the world of complexity, because that's what we ultimately are dealing with here with. It's a very complex environment with many things to consider, and I wouldn't know anyone better than Jeffrey to walk us through this.
Thank you, Pascal. I don't know that I have time to take you really deep, but I think even a high-level familiarity with the concept of complexity can be really useful as we're looking at a future of increasing interconnectedness and ever proliferating interdependencies, thinking about new relationships. I think that is a world of complexity, and I think it's important for us to understand how to make sense of complexity, because in this world, even the most powerful, even the best informed among us is still operating with imperfect information and limited influence. And in an increasingly complex world, understanding how far that influence goes and how those interrelationships work can make all the difference. Now, first, I want to unpack some terms here, because a lot of these things get tossed around, but in complexity thinking, the language matters. So if we take a look at something like, coming up with a new vaccine candidate. As I said, for the coronavirus right now, we have 89 right now in development. And this is something that we understand how to do pretty well. It's complicated. It's a really complicated technical challenge, but we have a body of applicable knowledge. We have experience. We understand the causal relationships. We understand the process for developing this stuff. And so we're able to do that. Now, it will be a different question to see which of these vaccines are durable solutions as the virus itself evolves, but just developing the candidates, getting to that point, is a process that we understand and can model fairly well, because it's a complicated problem. On the other hand, if we want to consider a truly complex challenge, let's consider what it means and what it looks like to try to coordinate the high-level, vast response to something like the coronavirus crisis. This is layered upon a human system, and it has elements that are complicated and technical. There are some real scientific and medical challenges there, but because we're having to work with the human system, with people and with culture, it all gets messy. And even having a sense of what might have worked before, what might have worked in the past or in another context, doesn't necessarily mean that we can predict future results. And that really, in a nutshell, is where we are as a species. We're at a moment where our past experience is increasingly difficult to use to understand future expectations and even to inform present practice. So let's take a look a little bit deeper here. And I have kind of a taxonomy for differentiating between complicated problems and complex challenges. And at the top, I want to point out that just because something falls on the complicated side doesn't mean it's easy. There are some really, really difficult, complicated problems, many of which we don't actually know a solution yet, but we believe there is one. And as I explain what a complex challenge is and how it's differentiated, one of the key things is that quite often a solution doesn't actually exist, and we might be chasing an illusion there. So let's dive in. In the domain of the complicated, you're dealing with something that is predictable, something that can be modeled reliably. On the other hand, in the realm of the complex, you have something that is unpredictable, that is adaptive, that is dynamic and exists in motion. In the complicated, you're dealing with problems and challenges that are solvable, a right answer exists, and it can probably be replicated or scaled. This is part of why we tend to be much more comfortable working in the realm of the complicated. This is where a lot of our engineering challenges live. This is where a lot of our challenges as managers might live. And this tends to be what we've been trained to do very well, is solve these complicated technical problems. We tend to be much less comfortable in the domain of the truly complex, where there might not be a solution, and where oftentimes we're hoping at best to understand a direction to move in rather than an actual destination that can ever be reached. This is where our tendency to want to solve a problem can actually work against us, because the problem may not be solvable. It may be a tension that we have to manage. In the realm of the complicated, you're working in an area where we understand causality, where we understand cause and effect. And it may require some analysis, but we can actually see and tease those out. And we can use those to inform the way that we're approaching the challenge. On the other hand, with the complex, while patterns may exist in a complex adaptive system, cause and effect might not be readily apparent. And we might only be able to suss out those causal relationships in hindsight. And that means we have to kind of learn by doing, probably make a lot of mistakes, and try to find patterns that might exist within a system as we test its boundaries. And that is part of why it's so difficult to bring a body of established knowledge, and oftentimes we find our expertise, quote unquote, frustrated. In the domain of the complicated, you're able to rely on good and best practice, the body of established knowledge. This is where you can turn to the experts that you have, the consultants that you might be able to bring in. On the other hand, with a complex challenge and an adaptive system, you have to work at looking for emergent practice. You have to, through experimentation, learn your way in the right direction, and then maybe start to evolve a strategy that is fit to that particular system. And even that may change over time, which is part of what makes these things so difficult for us. As I said, there are people that you can usually turn to when you have a really complicated problem. On the other hand, for navigating a complex challenge, you may have to develop the knowledge yourself. And that's where we really prioritize the experimentalist mindset, where they're going to learn their way towards a body of applicable knowledge, and then maybe we can bring that thing to bear on solving that challenge. And by solve, generally speaking, we're just looking for something that we can maintain, not necessarily an end to the effort. So let's take a real look at this. I think this taxonomy will further help us understand the differences and why it matters, understanding what you're looking at. So a complicated problem might include designing an electric vehicle. Not an easy thing to do. I couldn't do it, but I certainly know people who can. My brother's an engineer. I could turn to him, and given the time and the resources, he could design you a good electric vehicle. On the other hand, designing a smart city is a more complex challenge. It goes beyond the engineering, although it incorporates some of that, because it's layered upon a human system and has to incorporate all of the weird things that humans do. And as you all know, we're not as rational as we think we are. We tend to be unpredictable in weird ways. That's part of what makes urban design and the future of urban design such a devilishly wicked problem. Performing brain surgery, that's actually something we use as a metaphor sometimes for a really complicated problem. We say, well, it's not quite brain surgery. That's a difficult technical thing to pull off. On the other hand, actually changing human minds, rewiring the brain at the behavioral level, that's complex because it has that human element. This is one I particularly like, the difference between building a platform and building a community. And I like this example in particular because very often we're trying to build a new platform to build a new community. And here's where it gets really interesting. If we fail at this, very often we learn the wrong thing. And we say, oh, well, this didn't work because we didn't build the platform appropriately. Whereas we might be misunderstanding the nature of the challenge and not appropriately appreciating what it takes to build a complex community on top of that platform. And that's part of why we really need to understand these things, so that we not only choose the right way to approach, but that we learn the right things through our engagement with that problem. And of course, some of these become both, right? Some of the biggest challenges that we face have technical elements, but they also fall in the domain of the complex. One example you're probably familiar with, you probably have some experience, maybe you're doing this right now, transforming an organization. There are some aspects of this that are absolutely technical. They are complicated problems. You can change processes, for example, but because of the human and the cultural element, it still remains complex. And things that you may have learned with past experience, or that you might want to bring in from another organization or an industry that serves as an example, it turns out not to work in your organization. And we can't copy paste culture. We can't copy paste a transformation and expect, well, because it worked in Silicon Valley at this startup, it's definitely going to build a culture of innovation here. No, it's not ever that simple. And then the biggest challenge of all, I think the one that's going to really be what we reckon with the most in our lifetimes, is addressing climate change, where it has innumerable aspects that are complicated and technical, but at its heart, we're talking about how we change a human system. And yeah, I see some really interesting ones actually popping up here, where you all are starting to identify some of these yourselves. And I will encourage you to continue to do that and throw in, if there are complex challenges that you're facing right now, that you can differentiate from the complicated. I'd love to hear a few of those. Yeah, thinking about, this is definitely a behavioral change element, right? How we manage that COVID response, and thinking about social distancing and how that might interact with urban design, and thinking about how are we going to change our cities and the layout and the way that people experience urban geography and experience one another. Those are really interesting, complex challenges. Raising kids. Yeah, even if you take off the piece about permanently connected, just raising children, anything that has that element of human behavior. Jimena, transforming education. Yeah, absolutely. And I love that example because that's one that far too frequently people propose strictly technical solutions. Oh, well, if we get everyone an iPad, then we'll have solved the access problem for education. But no, it's a bigger, more complex challenge than that. I'm going to keep us driving, and I want to share some things that I think can be useful for all of you as you're working to navigate complexity. These, I think, are tried and true, and I think you'll find them very serviceable. Thing one to know, curiosity is everything. We are living in a world, we are living in a future where you need to develop the growth mindset rather than the fixed mindset. If you haven't read Carol Dweck's book, Mindset, it will make you a better leader, a better learner, a better parent, and probably a better person. So I encourage you to go with that. And when you're thinking about what do we need to encourage in 21st century education and leadership, I would say building curiosity. That's got to be at the base of the skill set. Related to that, in fact, I think we need to push ourselves to ask new and different questions. If we want to come up with new ideas and different answers, we have to start from a different point and ask those new questions. Related to that, we should probably be asking them of different people. This is critical. Learn to leverage multiple perspectives. Get outside of your own head. Get outside of your own industry. Find people who are not like you, who have experiences that are not like your own, and push yourself to understand what their expectations are for a product, for a service, for the future. Somebody threw in something about market research there. Yeah, if you're not engaging with a diversity of opinion, you're missing an opportunity. And to tie it back to COVID again, looking at world leaders and seeing who are they engaging to inform their policy response? What range of experts are they bringing into that conversation? I think has a significant correlation with how successful they are in navigating that complex challenge. Related to all of these is that experimentalist mindset. If we want to learn amid complexity, we have to be willing to experiment. That means you have to be wrong. You have to take some risks. We have to learn our way in the right direction, even if we don't necessarily know where we're going. You have to test the system so that you can find patterns and see boundaries. I'm going to throw in there, it's a good thing sometimes to start small. Complexity thinkers often suggest that you should find safe to fail experiments, right? Don't bet the farm the first time out. You need to understand the territory and the environment first. So you have to run those tests. You have to learn by doing. And the doing is really important. I would argue in a complex world, if you don't do, you don't learn. If you don't learn, you don't change. If you don't change, you can't adapt. And if you don't adapt, you might find that the future doesn't have much use for you as a leader. Push yourself to see the system. This is the value of experimentation, of exploration, of curiosity, of building empathy. You have to explore these things and you have to understand those interrelationships. Again, complexity is all about interdependency. How are the pieces and the parts connected? Resist the temptation to solve the problem. This is a hard thing for a lot of you. It's hard for me as well. You probably got to where you are because you're a really good problem solver. In many cases, we're really good managers, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're the kind of leaders that a complex world needs. And I would argue there's real value in resisting that urge to jump in there and solve, and instead making sure that we fully understand the nature of the challenge first, that we understand the system and the operating context that we're trying to work within, and we understand our partners. Part of the reason this is so difficult is because of our past lives experience. I'm throwing up here a little graph where that blue line that's your life effectively. And the axes, you have time and you have disequilibrium on the other side. So we can call disequilibrium is how far out of your comfort zone are you? And generally speaking, most of us have a level that we don't really like to exceed very often. We have kind of a limit of tolerance that we like to stay below. And particularly as we get older, further in our lives, further in our careers, we very often have more of an expectation that we will have the answers, that we've reached a point of mastery and ease. We know what we need to know and we like to stay in the zone. The problem is, if you stay in that comfort zone too frequently, you very often wind up back below what we call the threshold of learning. And so you're missing this really rich zone of productive disequilibrium. This is building on the work of Donald Heifetz and Martin Linsky on adaptive leadership. And they've identified this kind of Goldilocks, just right zone for learning, where you're far enough out of your comfort zone that you're challenged, that your mental models are exposed, your assumptions are challenged, and you have to learn. If future fitness exists and if adaptability can be built as a muscle, that is where we're going to do it. So we have to get more comfortable actually sitting with uncertainty, learning to do that. And it's not an easy thing to do. Yeah, a lot of you are starting to throw in things about adaptability. Awesome. That's the conversation we're having. And on that subject of adaptability, what are we really trying to do? Well, we're trying to create new narratives and position ourselves within them. And I think at the end of the day, that's a lot of what it takes to navigate complexity, is thinking about what kind of new narratives do we want to create? How do we share them, bring people into them, and help them along the path that we're envisioning? And that means that we have to be willing to let go of something. We have to be willing to kill the official future. Jeff, I would argue that this is key to unlearning. There's a management theorist and futurist named Christian Cruz who wrote an article about 5 years ago called Killing the Official Future, where he said that every organization, and indeed every individual, has an idea of what the world is going to be like. And they're operating against that, designing against that all the time. And unfortunately, those official futures sometimes sit on the shelf for far too long. They're not responsive to their context. We don't take them down and interrogate them. They can be inherited from the founders of the organization who came up with this idea years ago. Or you might have an idea of what your children's future is going to be like that is not actually appropriate to the context that they're moving into as they enter adulthood. We have to be willing to let go if we want to create space for possible futures. You have to let that official future go. And this, I actually think, is a difficult thing. It's harder than we think. If I tell you all, oh, you have to create new narratives, you can rattle off all sorts of things about what the world should be like, about the new narrative you want to get behind. But too frequently, we overlook the fact that to create space for something new, you have to be willing to let something else go. You have to ask yourself, what is my official future? What is my assumption about the future that's standing in the way of me creating or building the possible future that I want to enable? The possible new narrative that I want to build in the place of that old future that I'm ready to release. And with that, I'll end with one of my favorite new and different questions that I think is key to finding your new narrative. And that's this. I like to ask myself, I ask Pascal as well very often, what does the future need? Not what do I need? What do I want to take away from this experience? But what does the future need? And it's a weird question. It's kind of an uncomfortable one. But if you find yourself able to come up with an answer for that, you're one step closer to building something that truly matters. And I would argue that is the path to build for something beyond recovery and to actually think about resilience and relevance in the long term. With that, I know we're running low on time, so I want to throw out a couple quick takeaways to kind of summarize everything that we've talked about. So if you, at some point in the near future, like this gentleman, find yourself wandering around in the high desert with a briefcase, and you're wondering, what have you brought? What did you take from your experience with Pascal and Jeffrey? Well, I hope maybe in that briefcase you have some of these ideas. I hope that you'll remember to look out for weak signals and explore their residue. I hope that you'll remember to recognize complexity, and when faced with it, to navigate by learning rather than immediately rushing to a tried and true solution to a problem you think you recognize. And I hope you'll be willing to release the official future to create space for new narratives of possibility. And with that, I want to bring Pascal back into the conversation, and we can move toward a Q&A and a little wrap up. Pascal, hello.
Yeah, hello. So two quick things. One is, if you want to be in touch with us, if you send an empty email, just a blank email to this email address, behind this email address is a little robotic artificial intelligence, which isn't all that intelligent, it's artificial. And it will send you back an email with both Jeffrey and my personal contact details, our LinkedIn, and invites you also into a private network we have where we share. It's a distribution list where we share our latest research. So by all means, please be in touch and be in touch with us. The other thing I just wanted to reiterate just briefly, like what the hell are you actually going to do in the next, weeks or month ahead? And we get this question a lot from executives we work with. And the most important thing I can tell you, at least out of this particular content, is this. Really spend some time identifying the weak signals you're currently seeing. I think we all do this intuitively, but I believe it's very, very valuable for you to sit down and sketch them out. Write down what are the weak signals and thinking about which of these weak signals actually will have an impact on your organization, and what is the impact of these impacts, and what is the residue? What do you expect the residue for this to be? I think that's a very powerful thing you can do. The second one is, and Jeffrey already alluded to this, is the notion around creating new narratives. And I want to give you a quote from Ron Shaich. Ron is the founder of Panera Bread, very, very successful, healthy fast food chain here in the United States. He's a good friend of ours, and he gave me this. He said to me, Pascal, our approach has always been to discover today what will matter tomorrow, and then transform the company into a future that is unfolding before us. And what he means by this is, and I think this is so powerful, what he means by this is you create the future. There is no future per se. It is what you create. And the narrative of that future is yours to create and yours to communicate to your people. And then the last thing I have for you is, we couldn't get into this today, but there's a tool called disruption mapping, which we have taken, and it's a 40-year-old futurist tool, which we've taken and updated, and we call our version disruption mapping, which is a super quick it takes you 20 minutes to learn the tool, and it allows you to understand what are the consequences of the consequences. We just completed an online learning course for this tool, which is free. We're going to send this out to Jose Antonio and the team so that they can share this with you. So again, my invitation is learn this tool, spend 20 minutes over a weekend. It is insanely powerful. And we use this with clients all over the world, all the way from medium-sized businesses and leaders in those to community leaders, all the way up to, we recently brought this to Temasek, the sovereign wealth fund in Singapore. They're using this now across their fund. So with that being said, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us. It was a great honor and a great pleasure. I would just want to note, we do quite a bit of business in Latin America, across the Latin American continent. We love being down there. We can't wait for the travel ban to be lifted so that we get out of our goddamn, our goddamn country and come back and can visit your beautiful country. So thank you so much for having us.
Pascal, so much. Amazing presentation. I'm taking beside what you guys just summarized, the importance of having multiple perspectives on your view to have a deeper understanding of the problem. I think that's what we do on our on executive forums. that's our core value proposition, and I'm glad we are aligned and on the needs of the future. Also, I want to highlight what you said, guys, about prototyping and going and trying and going to action, because otherwise it's just theory. You just need to get out there and either fail or learn and go again. Thank you so much. So inspiring. We know you do a lot of future work. I think the things of the weak signals change from company to company, from industry to industry. That's something to take a look at. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. We appreciate you guys facilitating this conversation. Thank you, dear Executive Forum members, for taking the time, for being with us today. With this, we close this, and we'll keep in touch, my friend. Thank you all, guys.
Gracias. Thank you.